Okay, yeah, so thanks for the introduction. I will indeed be talking about Bless, which has a very cute logo, which was actually generated using one of those new fancy AI things. But a little bit about me. I am a doctoral researcher at the University of Iceland, where I am funded, because this is my fourth year, I'm funded by a variety of things, the computer science department, the Science Institute, the Statistics Institute, and also partially Quantsite Labs, which is where I maintain, among other things, F2Py within NumPy, the Fortran to Python generator, and a bunch of other codes. Yeah, these are all like basically acknowledgements. And so what I'm going to talk about, and I'm very happy to be here because I was actually very happy to find this workshop to begin with because I didn't know it was happening. And the way I found it is I was actually looking to go back to the SciPy website, I mean, the Scientific Python Conference website, but then, yeah, happy coincidence. So let's talk a little bit about reproducible research, which I'm sure most of us are well aware of, perhaps. And if not, well, the Turing Way is an excellent resource. But basically, when you're writing scientific code or you're generating results or simulated data, then you typically need to keep track of all of these steps. You need to know where your raw data came from, and then how you pre-processed it, and then how you analyzed it. And not just traditionally, you would just zoom in on this bit here and say, well, the rest is on request. Well, not such a great plan. And so to facilitate this, and also because nowadays high throughput calculations where you run maybe not a very computationally expensive calculation, but you launch many of them in parallel, are becoming very popular. They've always been popular in biology, but now also in material science and other things. And there are these workflow engines, and they're very good, really. So SnakeMake comes from the biological sciences mostly. And they all have roughly the same idea, which is that you have some sort of centralized location where you define your jobs and then it farms it out to different workers. And you can see that in a materials project here on the side, where basically you have parameters and you do something with it and you so on and so forth, right? And the idea here is that this automatically keeps track of the provenance and other things. The problem is complexity. So what happened was I was at this Center for Molecules, like CCAM. They had a workshop in Lausanne, and I was invited there to talk about how do you use workflow engines and how do they get better with faster Python libraries like NumPy, and F2Py. The biggest problem is most of these, and they typically come out as a paper. So if you have written a plugin, in this case, this does something fancy with solid state materials. It's not very important for our purposes. But the point is, just the plugin, a plugin into this provenance tracking system is a reasonable computational publication. Which is kind of strange if you think about it, because and essentially what that means is that these plugins and these workflow engines, they rely heavily on stable underlying codes, which is to say, if it's going to take you 2 or 3 months to plug it into, say, AIDA, you're probably not going to do that for your 0.01 versioned hobby project, right? And so the question is, what about development? Like, what happens to us? And, just a quick overview of the limitations again, which is that development code doesn't have a stable API, which means, rewriting these interfaces to all these workflow managers can be a pain. And you typically do a lot of debugging by standard out or just, and oftentimes logging can be very unreliable, especially in my field. Like, the logging can be good or terrible. It can have timestamps, doesn't have timestamps, outputs can vary, et cetera, et cetera. So, but honestly, for most of us, perhaps all of us in the audience, we know the solution to this, right? The pipe. You pipe it out to a file. If you want to be fancy and you also want to see what's going on, then, well, you pipe it into T to view while you're writing it to the file as well. The problem is, over time, as you keep doing this, you eventually reach a situation like this. Now, remember, this is different from having a good Git commit strategy. Like, of course, you should commit your changes and blah, blah. But this is like when you're just testing things. And this is perhaps, more of a scientific workflow issue in some sense, right? That like, I swear there was this label thing. I changed one parameter and it's really, really important, I think. And I just need to see the output. But, and you end up with something like this, which is pretty bad, really. And I'm going to speed up just a little bit. So basically, let's focus on the features, forget about the desert data because I talked about it a little bit. So we have a file output, which is a compressed output, and we have a MongoDB. And basically, it's labels and UIDs and time. I will spend a little bit on this. So the logic here is that we overload the This should be head N1. I deleted it because it won't fit on the slide. The idea is that we overload logging calls within, I'm now using Fern. Previously, I was rolling my own. But so essentially, trace is used to get the additional data, which, for example, this is timing information, which Bless is adding. So it's an annotation. The timestamped standard out. So this is both timestamped and that comes with the info. And then the errors are, of course, so Bless's own errors come with error and a standard error because sometimes some codes for some reason emit warnings to standard error. So it defaults to using one. That's well and good. It's not bad at all, but like we can get even better metadata, especially if we're using like, if we're writing a tool, it might as well do something more than what you can get with bash pipes, right? So in this case, I was interested in a MongoDB backend. And so here, it's a very simple struct. Again, this is, the strength of the Rust ecosystem and how easy it makes to run all of these things and connect the dots is really nice. And you can really see that here. We basically store the entire output as a gzip file, which is nice because we store it as a binary blob. This does mean you need to now have a little Python script to pull it out. But previously, the other problem is if you're just appending to a string with vec new or something, then you're going to run out of memory. And unfortunately, unlike in C and C++, where you'd get a nice runtime error or stack overflow, Rust, at least what I was doing, just seemed to hang, which was pretty annoying. I mean, yeah. And let's see. So like I said, two types of timing. First of all, we do the process timer, which is very, very simple. And we also, just by virtue of logging it as it comes, we get this time-stamped standard out, which means you can, also benchmark parts of the code, which may not actually provide any benchmarking options. So then the next question is, of course, because everyone's interested in performance, is it how much overhead do we have? So by the way, so these are the commands because they didn't fit there. So the Mongo run, of course, you need to provide the your instance and you can provide a label. And basically you go from like 2% to 8% if you're depending on which one you're running. And honestly, I should also point out that when you do the standard pipe, the one which is the relative one here, then this does not, of course, include any compression at all. And compression can be significant because a lot of scientific codes still write out very verbose plain text files, which get beautifully compressed by gzip. And that's actually almost it. I see I'm almost at time as well. So basically the point is there's near zero overhead for this. It is much better. So it's an additional context for you, as in why were you trying those things, especially if, for example, your supervisor or colleagues asked, did you try this with your code? You don't need to think about it. It's all in your MongoDB database. You just search for the label or note or whatever else you'd like. We are at 0.1.0, so contributors are very welcome. And yeah, I'd like to end with acknowledgements to faculty and some of my funding and my family and everybody else, also people here. And yes, that's it. I'll take questions.
Thank you, Rohit. Do we have any questions for Rohit in the chat? Okay, well, I have a question. So how have you been using this tool in your own research, and in what way have you quantified how much more productive it's made you when you're experimenting?
So for things like, so we mostly do a lot of parameter searches, but also not really. Like if we're deciding whether or not we want to switch between, say, LBFGS or like steepest descent or something, it's not important enough to have two different versions or two different branches and compare and so on and so forth. But, it's just something which I want to quickly benchmark. And so that really helps because I just compile the code, label it with a run and stick it in there. So later I can just pull out all that data, which is quite nice.